Welcome to The Deep Dive, part of the Remedify Coaching Program podcast. Our mission here is, well, pretty simple. To give you the deepest possible shortcut to being really well informed on the topics that truly define modern health and longevity.
That's our goal.
And today, we're taking an exhaustive look at a stack of sources that, frankly, fundamentally challenge decades of conventional wisdom regarding diet.
Yeah, they really do.
We're diving deep into the profound and, let's be honest, kind of alarming connection between common dietary fats, chronic illness, and the foundational health of your cells, specifically your mitochondria.
Exactly. The framework we're dissecting today revolves around a strategy known as the rock-solid diet. And it really rests on an extremely precise, actionable, and, well, for many people, a pretty radical premise.
Yep.
Our source material argues compellingly that many modern diseases of civilization, the chronic illnesses just overwhelming our healthcare systems, they're not primarily driven by the traditional villains we always hear about, like saturated fat or cholesterol. Instead, they point squarely at a pervasive industrial-scale dietary component, omega-6 fatty acids, specifically linoleic acid, or LA.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because that core claim is huge. The sources are alleging that excessive consumption of these omega-6 fatty acids leads directly to structural and functional damage in the mitochondria. And that specific metabolic damage is the direct precursor to our most feared chronic diseases, including cancer. So our mission for this deep dive is clear. Extract the compelling scientific arguments for this claim, and crucially, define the practical, measurable threshold for avoidance that the sources actually prescribe.
We need a target, right?
We absolutely need a target. This isn't about vague advice like eat less bad fat anymore. We're going to show you the calculations, the reasoning that leads to a specific, non-negotiable threshold for daily consumption.
Okay.
The goal here is clarity. Defining an actionable, measurable threshold for avoidance, not just debating some theoretical ratio forever.
Yeah.
Let's start with the conversation that many people are probably already familiar with, the omega ratio. For years, the widely quoted recommendation has been that the ideal omega-6 to omega-3 ratio should be, what, 2-to-1?
Yeah.
Or maybe even lower if possible.
Right. 2-to-1, ideally 1-to-1. That sounds like basic chemistry, simple matter of balance.
Yeah. Seems achievable.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
That 2-to-1 ratio would represent a healthy equilibrium, something closer to what human physiology evolved with. But our sources present data that shows just how spectacularly we have failed to maintain that balance in the modern world. This is where the reality check really hits hard. Data for the U.S. population shows that our average consumption ratio has just spiraled completely out of control.
Yeah.
I mean, back in 2000, the average was already pretty awful at 16-to-1.
16, wow.
Yeah. But by 2020, that number had climbed even higher, reaching a frankly ridiculous 20-to-1.
20-to-1, it feels like such a simple number. But what does a 20-to-1 ratio actually mean inside your body at the cellular level?
Well, think about it this way. It means that every single time your body needs to build or repair a cellular membrane, which is happening constantly, across trillions of cells, it has 20 times more of these fragile pro-inflammatory omega-6 components available than the stable, beneficial omega-3 components it really needs.
That sounds structurally unsound.
It is. This structural integrity problem translates directly into systemic metabolic dysfunction, which we'll definitely get into more detail on later in Section 5. But the sheer magnitude of this imbalance proves we're not just slightly misaligned here. The modern diet is, you could say, structurally broken.
So to understand how we got into this mess, we have to look at the inputs. Where are these fats coming from? The sources are really specific about this.
They are. On the omega-3 side, the fats your body truly needs and can use readily are EPA and DHA.
Right, the fish oil ones.
Exactly. These are predominantly found in animal products. Cold water fish, seafood, and, to a lesser extent, in grass-fed meat, organs, dairy, and eggs. Now, for people relying on plant sources like flaxseed or chia, which contain ALA, the sources are pretty adamant. You can basically forget about using ALA to fix this particular problem. The conversion rate of ALA into the usable EPA and DHA is estimated to be extremely low, often cited around like 4%, maybe even less for some people.
Only 4%.
Yeah, it makes plant-based ALA intake practically negligible when you're trying to correct a deficit of this enormous scale. It just doesn't move the needle enough.
Okay, so omega-3s are mainly animal-sourced and hard to get enough of from plants. Then there's the villain, omega-6, specifically linoleic acid, LA. Where is the absolute tsunami of LA coming from?
Well, linoleic acid is naturally present in plant foods, grains, seeds, nuts, that kind of thing.
Right.
But the true exponential increase, especially since, say, the late 19th century, really stems from industrialized agriculture and food technology.
Ah, the processing.
Exactly. That's the technology-driven extraction of seed oils, what we generically call vegetable oils or cooking oils.
Yeah.
Think sunflower, canola, safflower, corn oil, and especially soybean oil. It's everywhere. This industrial process concentrates the LA content into an unprecedented biological payload, delivered cheaply and ubiquitously across basically the entire modern food supply.
And this leads us right into what the sources call the supplementation fallacy. This is where the math gets genuinely shocking and really drives home the point that just trying to boost your omega-3 intake with supplements is, well, it's futile against the sheer volume problem.
It really is. Let's just lay out the precise numbers, okay? If the average daily omega-6 consumption in the U.S. is currently around 40 grams per day, which is a conservative estimate for me.
1 grams, okay.
And your target ratio is 2 to 1, simple math tells you, you would need to consume 20 grams of usable omega-3, EPA, and DHA every single day just to achieve that equilibrium.
20 grams of omega-3, that sounds like a huge amount. How much actual food or supplement is that?
It's functionally impossible for the average person. To get 20 grams of EPDH, you'd need to swallow roughly 67 standard fish oil capsules daily.
Wait, 67 capsules
Yeah.
every day?
Every single day, just to reach that baseline balance, assuming you didn't change your 40G LA intake.
Yeah.
Or, alternatively, you'd need to eat about 2.5 pounds of high-fat fish like salmon every single day.
2.5 pounds of salmon.
Yeah.
That's a massive caloric commitment, right? That's going to
Yeah.
be thousands of extra
Oh,
calories.
easily. Well over 3,000 extra calories a day, depending on the specific cut. And the sources also crunched the numbers on the economic cost. They estimated that attempting this level of supplementation, either via high-quality fish or specialized oils, would run close to $10,000 a month.
$10,000 a month. Okay,
Right.
that's just not feasible.
That figure alone should just shut down the whole just balance the ratio argument immediately, right?
Right.
It highlights the core insight from this material. This is fundamentally a volume and toxicity problem caused by the sheer quantity of omega-6 in the modern food environment. It's not a simple omega-3 deficiency.
Right.
Therefore, the only viable, realistic path to correct this dangerous imbalance and actually achieve measurable health benefits is rigorous, focused elimination and avoidance of these omega-6 sources. It's about drastically cutting the input.
The historical correlation you mentioned between introducing this massive omega-6 volume and the rise of chronic disease, that's perhaps the most compelling part of this initial argument. The sources connect the timeline of seed oil consumption directly to the emergence of what they call the diseases of civilization, or DOCs.
It's a tragedy, really, that unfolds across just 150 years or so. I mean, look back 100 or 200 years. And diseases like cancer, massive heart attacks, type 2 diabetes, widespread obesity, they were virtually unknown. Rare curiosities.
So what were people dying from back then?
In 1900, the top causes of death were infectious things like pneumonia, tuberculosis, gastrointestinal infections. Humans were dying relatively quickly from external threats, bacteria, viruses.
But the whole metabolic landscape just flipped completely. By 2010, something like 7 of the top 10 causes of death are these slow-burning chronic metabolic diseases. The speed and the severity of that shift are almost unbelievable when you think about it.
Let's just quickly review the sources breakdown of those increases because they are staggering. Heart disease deaths, for instance, rose 12-fold, 12 times, escalating from about 2.6% to 32% of all deaths.
A third of all deaths.
Yeah. The prevalence of type 2 diabetes saw a 28 times increase. It moved from being a statistical rarity, like 0.4% of the population, to a major population crisis at 10.5% and still climbing.
And the cancer data. That's where the scale of this metabolic tragedy just really sinks in.
It's truly astonishing. Deaths attributed to cancer increased 602 times.
600 times. That can't be right.
That's not a typo. 602 times, from 0.5% of the population to 31% of deaths. And obesity has similarly soared, rising 33 times over the last century, with projections suggesting we could hit 50% of Americans categorized as obese by 2030.
Wow.
The sources argue forcefully that the inception of widespread industrialized omega-6 consumption, particularly the massive increase delivered via cheap seed oils starting in the early 20th century, correlates almost perfectly with the devastating emergence of this entire chronic disease cluster. The timeline is just too precise to dismiss as coincidence.
Okay, when we talk about the rise of chronic disease, especially heart disease, we absolutely have to pause and address the explanation that has dominated public health for, 70 years. The flawed lipid hypothesis, which the sources seem determined to dismantle.
Oh, absolutely. That hypothesis, championed largely by the scientist Ansel Keys back in the 1950s, basically declared that eating saturated fat and dietary cholesterol was the direct cause of atherosclerosis, the plaque buildup that clogs arteries, and therefore the primary driver of heart attacks.
Right. That became the foundation of modern dietary fear. Fear of fat, fear of eggs, fear of red meat.
Exactly. And his foundational evidence, that famous 1953 six-country study, became like dietary gospel. On the surface, it sounded compelling, didn't it? It offered a seemingly clear answer to a rising health problem. It did seem clear. It was compelling partly because it was selectively presented. Keyes highlighted the contrast between, say, Japan, where fat intake was about 5% of calories and heart disease rates were low, and the U.S., where fat intake was around 35% and death rates were 4 times higher. His conclusion: fat and cholesterol must be the causal agents.
But hang on, you said selectively presented. We have to inject some skepticism here. The sources say this hypothesis is fundamentally discredited now. If the evidence seemed so strong initially, why did it persist for so long, even when other data started contradicting it?
Well, it persisted partly because it offered a simple, actionable narrative, right? And importantly, it was a narrative that the industrial food complex could really monetize, replace traditionally expensive animal fats with these new, cheap, industrially produced seed oils, margarine over butter, vegetable oil over lard.
Ah, the economics.
But when unbiased data analysis was eventually conducted, the theory just didn't hold up. In fact, many high-quality, well-controlled studies actually showed an inverse correlation in many populations.
Yep.
The more saturated fat people ate, the less mortality they experienced from all causes, including heart disease sometimes.
So the opposite of what Keyes claimed. What about the data manipulation aspect of Keyes' own work? If the correlation wasn't really there in the broader data, how did he make it look so strong in his study?
That's the key point. The sources revealed the selection bias. Keyes selectively chose only 6 countries out of many more available that happened to support his initial hypothesis for his publication.
Only 6. How many were available?
If he had included all 22 countries that had available data in the WHO dataset at the time, the correlation between saturated fat intake and heart disease mortality would have essentially vanished. It just wasn't there. Comprehensive, unbiased WHO data presented in the sources clearly showed the trend line between the percentage of saturated fat in the diet and cardiovascular disease death rate was actually trending down slightly, or was flat for both men and women, directly contradicting the central narrative we were all told.
This inconsistency is perfectly illustrated by the famous French paradox, isn't it? It's puzzled mainstream dietitians for decades. The French traditionally eat a diet rich in saturated fats, lots of butter, cream, cheese, fatty meats, often getting around 30% of their calories from fat, yet they historically had very low rates of heart attacks.
That paradox is only a paradox if you're stuck believing the flawed lipid hypothesis. The French paradox isn't contradictory at all if you realize that saturated fat and cholesterol are not the primary culprits initiating the arterial damage.
Okay.
This forces us to pivot, then, to the true mechanism of atherosclerosis initiation, as defined by our sources, what really starts the plaque forming.
So if saturated fat isn't the initiating mechanism, what is the trigger for that plaque formation in the arteries?
The sources are crystal clear on this point. The very first essential step in the formation of atherosclerotic plaque is the oxidation of LDL cholesterol. LDL itself isn't inherently the villain, it's the oxidized LDL. That's a crucial distinction with massive dietary implications.
Oxidized LDL.
Okay.
And this is where the omega-6 fats enter the stage as the true antagonist, according to this view. Which type of fat is uniquely structured to actually cause that LDL cholesterol to oxidize within the artery wall?
It's the omega-6 fats. Saturated fats are chemically very stable. They have single bonds. They don't readily oxidize under normal biological conditions. Polyunsaturated fats like linoleic acid, LA, are chemically fragile. They have multiple double bonds, which makes them highly susceptible to oxidation when exposed to things like heat, light, or just the inflammatory stress inside the body.
Right.
The sources state unequivocally that these omega-6 fats are the primary substance that oxidizes the LDL cholesterol within the artery walls. This makes them the actual root cause, the initiator of atherosclerotic plaque formation.
So this implies the dietary advice we received for decades to actively replace stable saturated fats like butter and lard with fragile seed oils high in LA was not only wrong, but potentially actively harmful, replacing a relatively benign substance with the very thing that initiates the disease process.
That's the forceful and, frankly, quite disturbing conclusion drawn from this material.
Hmm.
The real, quantifiable villain behind the epidemic rise of heart disease and atherosclerosis is the excessive intake of omega-6, delivered overwhelmingly via industrial seed oils, not the saturated fats we were systematically taught to fear and eliminate for half a century.
All right, if omega-6 is the primary metabolic driver of chronic disease, as these sources claim, then achieving the necessary avoidance requires almost surgical precision. We need to know exactly where all this LA is hiding in the modern food supply. The consumption chart detailed in the sources seems key here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The chart lays out the current U.S. omega-6 intake by food group, and the results are, well, pretty staggering because one category just absolutely dominates. By far, the biggest contribution comes directly from vegetable oils themselves, cooking oils, salad oils. They account for a massive 60% of all U.S. omega-6 intake.
60% just from the oils themselves.
Yeah. Then miscellaneous fats and oils, including those hidden in packaged goods and processed foods, add another 11%. So right there, you've got almost 3/4 of the entire problem coming just from added oils and fats.
That's huge. What about the animal products that contribute? This is often where people might be surprised, thinking animal fat is just animal fat.
They are often surprised, yeah, because they don't realize how modern agricultural feeding practices have fundamentally compromised the fat quality of non-ruminant animals. Chicken and turkey contributes about 7% of the total LA load currently, and pork adds another 4%. These animal sources, along with nuts and grains, which contribute about 11% combined, round out the major drivers. Now contrast this with traditionally healthy whole foods. Dairy, eggs, beef, and especially fruits and vegetables, they contribute less than 2% individually. Pure fruits and veggies are less than 1%.
So the target is clear.
It clearly dictates that any effective avoidance strategy absolutely must target the oils directly and also these compromised non-ruminant animal fats. That's where the bulk of the LA is coming from.
Let's break down the vegetable oil spectrum then, based specifically on their linoleic acid LA content. We need a clear ranking, a danger list for the listener.
Definitely. At the very top, we have the super high LA group. These are oils where the fatty acid composition is between 50% and 62% pure linoleic acid. This includes common oils like sunflower, soybean, corn, cottonseed, safflower oil. These are immediate, non-negotiable must-avoids for any cooking or consumption according to this framework.
Okay, total avoidance for those. What about oils that are sometimes marketed as healthier options, like canola or peanut?
They fall into the next category, high LA, but still far too high for this approach. Peanut oil, canola oil, rapeseed oil, they're still loaded with LA. But here's where it gets a bit more nuanced. Olive oil and palm oil fall into what the sources call the moderate LA category.
Moderate, okay, but caution needed.
Caution is absolutely needed, especially with olive oil. The LA content in olive oil can range wildly, from as low as maybe 3% in some very high-quality, fresh-pressed oils, all the way up to an unsafe 25% or even higher in older, purely stored or blended oils. It depends entirely on the growing conditions, the processing, the age, how it's stored.
Wow, that's a huge range. So how does someone navigate buying something as common as olive oil safely within this framework?
The sources advise basically a detective-level approach. You should really only purchase olive oil that explicitly labels its polyunsaturated fatty acid, PUFA, content on the bottle. And the rule of thumb, based on the rock-solid framework, is to stay below 10% LA, but ideally you want that number below 6% for regular use.
And if the label doesn't specify the PUFA content?
Assume it's compromised and avoid it.
Yeah.
There's just too much variability otherwise.
Okay. And is there a clear winner for a safe cooking fat based purely on these LA metrics?
Coconut oil is the benchmark winner here,
Wow.
clocking in at only about 2% LA content. Its stability due to being highly saturated, coupled with that super low LA, makes it the highly recommended fat of choice for any kind of high-heat cooking within this diet. The sources basically impose a maximum LA percentage threshold of around 6% for any fat used regularly, and most modern cooking oils just fail that test miserably.
This brings us to the rock-solid avoidance list, which gives the listener the practical application, the how-to for achieving this elimination goal.
Right. This list covers the major routes of exposure you need to shut down. Number 1. You absolutely must avoid seed oils directly, both in your own kitchen for cooking and baking, and also in things like commercial salad dressings.
Okay.
2. Avoid foods that are essentially just seed oil delivery vehicles. Things like standard commercial mayonnaise, many creamy sauces, dips, most processed dressings.
Got it.
3. You have to avoid basically all commercially fried foods. Why? because 99.99% of commercial frying operations use the cheapest possible high LA seed oils. So that means French fries, potato chips, corn chips, fried chicken, fish and chips.
Hmm.
It's almost all cooked in high LA oils.
That cuts out a lot of convenience food.
It does. 4, processed foods require constant label vigilance.
Hmm.
You must check every label for any mention of vegetable oil, soybean oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, etc. It hides everywhere.
Okay.
5, avoid most flour-based dough products like commercial pizza, crackers, cookies, donuts, pastries. They almost always rely heavily on added seed oils for texture, mouthfeel, and shelf stability.
Right, makes sense.
And finally, number 6, and this surprises many people. Due to their high fat content and naturally high LA levels, you basically need to avoid virtually all nuts and seeds or limit them extremely strictly. Even a small handful of something like almonds or walnuts can contain multiple grams of LA, pushing you dangerously close to the daily limit very quickly.
That avoidance list is definitely comprehensive, but it still leads back to that central, measurable question. What is the maximum safe daily intake? We need to go from this general avoidance advice to a specific limit in grams per day. This seems like the cornerstone of the entire rock-solid dietary framework.
It absolutely is. And this is the truly fascinating part of the deep dive, the detective work the sources undertook based on ancestral biology and historical data. The goal was to determine the precise amount of daily linoleic acid intake, measured in grams, that results in the same LA percentage found in the adipose tissue, your stored body fat of historically healthy, non-westernized populations.
Okay, so looking at the body fat of people who didn't eat modern processed food.
Exactly. Your adipose tissue acts as a long-term reservoir, reflecting your average dietary fat intake over time. And studies focusing on groups like Polynesians or other non-westernized populations examined back in the mid-20th century before seed oils became globally dominant showed a remarkably consistent, low average LA content in their adipose tissue. It clustered tightly around 3.2%.
3.2%. That was the natural human baseline, essentially.
That seems to be the healthy ancestral target, yes. The range observed was quite narrow, typically from about 2.6% up to maybe 4.0%. So this 3.2% adipose tissue percentage is what the science deems the healthy ancestral LA storage level.
So if the body's long-term LA storage should ideally be around 3.2%, how do you translate that storage metric back into a daily intake limit? How many grams per day leads to that outcome?
You connect it using robust scientific modeling. The sources specifically reference the GU meta-analysis from 2015. This is a comprehensive study that looked at multiple populations and correlated the amount of LA people ingested, measured in grams per year, with the resulting percentage of LA found in their adipose tissue biopsies. It established a clear mathematical relationship.
Okay, so they plug the target number into that relationship.
Precisely. By plugging that healthy ancestral target of 3.2% adipose LA into the correlation graph derived from the GU meta-analysis, the required calculation yields an annual intake of 3,750 grams of linoleic acid per year.
3,750 grams per year. And when we divide that by 365 days?
That translates to approximately 10.5 grams per day. The source material rounds this number down slightly for a margin of safety and simplicity, giving us the core metric, the central rule for the rock-solid diet. The absolute upper limit for linoleic acid consumption is 10 grams per day.
10 grams, that's the number.
That's the number. This precise limit transforms the whole concept of avoidance from just a vague philosophy into a concrete, quantifiable daily goal you can actually track and manage.
Okay, that 10-gram limit, that's a powerful tool. It really changes the entire conversation, doesn't it? It goes from just eat less of this food group to do not exceed this specific measurable threshold. We've covered the pretty shocking historical context. We've looked at how decades of flawed dietary advice might have led us astray. And now we've established this precise, scientifically derived daily limit.
Right. And if you are finding this level of scientific precision and this kind of actionable strategy compelling, and you want access to the practical tools, maybe tracking resources, educational material, you'd need to actually implement this approach effectively in your own life.
Yeah?
We highly recommend you visit the website, agtts.website.beacons.aak2020. That site offers guides, calculators, food lists, and other resources designed to really help you make hitting that 10-gram LA maximum achievable day in and day out.
Okay, that's https://website.beacons.aakk2020. And remember, as always, you can also find additional resources and links, maybe to some of the underlying research we're discussing in this deep dive, just by checking the episode description in your podcast app.
Definitely check those out.
Now let's get back into it and tackle the animal fat controversy, because this is where modern food production really seems to betray consumer expectations about what's healthy. Right. The next section of the source material highlights what it actually terms the dirty secret of livestock. Many people who believe in, say, ancestral eating or paleo diets might assume that all animal fats are inherently healthy, stable fats like they used to be. But modern farming has apparently completely corrupted that expectation for certain animals.
That assumption used to be generally true, yes, but it's simply no longer reliable across the board. The key biological fact to grasp here is the difference between ruminant animals and monogastric animals. Non-ruminant mammals and birds, think pigs, chickens, turkeys, are monogastric, like us. It means they basically accumulate the types of fats they eat directly into their own fat tissue.
So garbage in, garbage out, essentially.
Pretty much. And what does modern industrial livestock feed consist of? It's dominated by cheap, high omega-6 commodity products.
Oh.
Soy meal, corn, and something called dried distillers grains, or DDGS, which is a byproduct of ethanol production, also very high in LA. So if the animal eats feed loaded with LA day after day, you end up eating high LA fat when you consume that animal.
Let's look at the specific consequences of this shift, starting with something really common. Pork fat, or lard. How has that changed?
The change documented in the sources is dramatic. Historical data shows that back in 1979, pork fat LA content was around 10%. Manageable, maybe, but the sources show that today's average conventional pork fat sits somewhere around 17% LA.
From 10% to 17%, that's almost an 80% increase in the LA content in just a few decades.
Exactly, an 80% increase. And even specialized pasture-raised pigs, while generally better, still showed significant variation. Some studies cited found cuts measuring as high as 8.6% LA, even in pastured animals, depending on their supplemental feed. So if you buy standard conventional pork products today, you are almost certainly consuming fat with a highly compromised, high LA percentage.
And chicken, often pushed as the healthy, lean meat choice, is apparently even worse in this context.
Yeah, according to the data presented, chicken fat was already surprisingly high back in the late 1970s, around 19.5% LA.
Yeah.
But modern industrial feeding practices, which sometimes include adding extra seed oils directly to the feed to quickly fatten the birds.
They add oil to the feed.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
This can push that number dramatically higher. Specific studies referenced showed that aggressively feeding seed oils could result in chicken thigh fat LA content soaring to a mind-blowing 38.5% linoleic acid.
38% LA.
Wow. Yeah. The sources conclude the average LA percentage in conventional chicken fat today probably hovers around 22%. This is precisely why fried fatty chicken, which is a double whammy of compromised chicken fat plus compromised high LA frying oil, is highlighted as one of the single worst foods you can possibly consume within this specific dietary framework.
And this high omega-6 load even transfers into eggs, doesn't it? Even though eggs are often considered a health food staple.
Yes, unfortunately, eggs suffer a similar fate due to the hen's feed. Conventionally produced eggs typically have around 15% LA in their fatty acids, specifically in the yolk fat. And here's the really discouraging reality check for people who consciously try to buy better eggs. Switching to organic or even pasture-raised eggs only drops that LA content negligibly, maybe down to about 13.5%.
So not much difference there.
Not nearly enough to make them a low LA food. While those higher quality eggs might be superior in terms of vitamins, maybe omega-3 content, they are still significant contributors to your daily LA load. They become a food that absolutely must be tracked carefully against that 10-gram daily limit. You can't just eat them freely without considering the LA impact.
Thankfully, the sources say there is a safe zone in the animal kingdom, and it relates back to their unique biology, right?
Yes, we are somewhat saved by the ruminants and fish. Ruminant animals, cows, sheep, goats, bison, lamb, possess a specialized digestive system with multiple stomach compartments. Crucially, their gut bacteria effectively convert dietary omega-6s, even from things like corn or soy feed, into safer, saturated or monounsaturated fatty acids through a process called biohydrogenation.
Their gut microbes fix the problem.
Essentially, yes. This biological process means that meat, like beef or lamb, and dairy products, like butter or cheese, from ruminant animals remain reliably low in linoleic acid, generally staying around 2% to 4% LA content, regardless of what they ate, within reason. Fish, too, are deemed safe because they naturally retain significantly more beneficial omega-3s than omega-6s, even when farmed, making them safe to eat plentifully.
Okay, so given this modern reality of compromised pork and poultry fat, we have to recalculate what constitutes a safe, routine cooking fat. If we want to stay below that strict 6% LA threshold the sources recommend for fats used regularly, what are the only truly viable options left?
The list gets pretty short, but it's reliable. Basically looking at coconut oil, which we mentioned is only about 2% LA, tallow, which is rendered beef fat, and that reliably sits around 2–4% LA, and butter, which is typically around 3% LA.
That's it.
Pretty much. For fats you'd use regularly in significant amounts. If a fat source is consistently above that 6% LA mark, like lard from conventional pork, chicken fat, or almost all processed vegetable oils, it has to be viewed with extreme skepticism. It either needs to be severely limited based on the specific cut's fat content and your total daily intake, or in many cases completely avoided to stay under that 10-gram ceiling.
This level of detail seems like it would be really hard to manage just by reading labels, especially since LA content isn't usually listed. This is where the practical tool comes in, right? The Omega-6 calculator, which the listener can find at rocksoliddiet.com.
Exactly. That calculator is crucial for translating food choices into actual LA grams. And the key to using it effectively is understanding the necessary calculation logic it performs. The total LA amount in grams from any food is determined by multiplying three factors together.
Yeah.
First, the total serving weight of the food you ate in grams.
Okay.
Second, the total fat percentage within that specific food. And third, the crucial part, the linoleic acid percentage within that fat. This calculation is critical because it properly differentiates the quality of the fat you're eating. For example, a high-fat food like beef can actually be very safe if the LA percentage of that beef fat is low, like 2–4%. But conversely, a relatively low-fat food could still be dangerous if the small amount of fat it does contain has a very high LA percentage, like some processed snacks or even certain nuts.
Let's run through those practical scenarios using the calculator to illustrate this, aiming for that 10-gram maximum limit. Let's start with a snack many people still consider healthy: peanuts.
Okay, peanuts. Imagine a 50-gram snack of peanuts. It's not a huge bag, maybe just a modest handful, right? Peanuts are roughly 50% fat by weight. And the peanut fat itself is typically around 32% linoleic acid.
Okay.
So when you multiply 50-gram serving size by 50% fat content, and then multiply that by 32% LA within the fat, the result is 8 grams of linoleic acid.
8 grams from one small snack.
8 grams. You just consumed 80% of your entire 10-gram daily limit with a single, seemingly innocent snack. That's how incredibly quickly the limit can be hit with these high LA plant fats.
Wow. Okay. What about if someone mistakenly uses a supposedly heart-healthy, high LA cooking oil like sunflower oil, thinking they're doing the right thing by avoiding saturated fat?
Let's take just 3 tablespoons of sunflower oil. That's about 50 grams in weight. Sunflower oil is essentially 100% fat, and about 62% of that fat is pure linoleic acid.
Uh-oh.
Do the math. 50 grams times 100% fat times 62% LA. That single small amount of oil yields a whopping 31 grams of linoleic acid.
31 grams. That's triple the daily limit.
Exactly. That exceeds the 10-gram maximum by 300% in just one go. This visceral example really shows why avoiding these high LA seed oils in their pure liquid form is absolutely the single most important non-negotiable step in following this dietary approach.
Okay, let's compare 2 key scenarios from the sources using the calculator when trying to hit a substantial meal goal, say getting around 2,200 calories and maybe 120 grams of protein for the day.
All right, scenario A, success. Let's say you consume 5 standard beef hamburger patties throughout the day, maybe cooked in their own fat or a bit of added tallow. That's about 500 grams of ground beef total. We use the calculator input for standard ground beef fat, which is reliably low at about 2.1% LA content.
Okay.
This easily meets the caloric and protein goals, but because the fat quality is so high, low LA, the total LA intake for the day from those 5 patties is only about 5 grams. Plenty of room left under the 10-gram ceiling. The quality of the fat allows you to eat a large, satisfying amount of food safely.
Okay, that works. Now, scenario B, failure. Let's just substitute those 5 beef hamburgers with 5 ground pork patties instead, using the calculator input for conventional pork fat at that compromised 17% LA average we discussed earlier. Same amount of food, just different animal.
The results are dramatically different and quite alarming. Those same 500 grams of ground meat, simply by switching the type of animal fat from low LA beef to high LA pork, now result in approximately 17 grams of linoleic acid for the day.
17 grams? That's a 70% overshoot of the maximum 10-gram limit.
A 70% overshoot. This is such a critical insight, host speaker. Even though the overall amount of fat in the beef and pork might be fairly similar, the quality of that fat, specifically its LA percentage, determines whether the food acts like metabolic medicine or metabolic poison within this framework. It shows you absolutely have to be highly selective about the type of animal fat you consume regularly.
And finally, the classic processed food example used in the sources, pizza.
Right. If you consume enough standard pepperoni pizza to hit that same 2,200 calorie goal for the day, the calculator estimates you'll take in around 17 grams of linoleic acid.
Same as the pork scenario.
Exactly. And this highlights it regardless of the macronutrient breakdown: carbs, protein, fat, high omega-6 load, likely coming from oils in the dough, processed cheese, and maybe the pepperoni itself, is a primary quantifiable reason why that food is considered metabolic junk, according to this model. The calculator turns general nutritional advice into an undeniable, measurable result based on LA content.
Now we arrive at the really foundational scientific support. Why does hitting that strict 10-gram LA limit matter so profoundly? The source material connects this entire dietary strategy back to perhaps the most critical issue in modern medicine: preventing chronic disease, particularly cancer. The core idea presented is centered squarely on mitochondrial health.
Yes, exactly. The inability of a cell to efficiently burn glucose for fuel is famously known as the Warburg effect, and it's universally considered the metabolic hallmark of cancer cells. Our sources strongly contend that mitochondrial damage, specifically damage to the delicate machinery within the mitochondria that processes both fats and glucose for energy, is the absolute precursor, the necessary first step, leading to this cancerous metabolic dysfunction.
Okay, so how exactly does excessive omega-6 consumption cause this specific mitochondrial damage? The sources reference a pivotal, albeit older, 2004 study that used rats fed a diet very rich in omega-6 PUFAs. Specifically, 20% of their calories came from sunflower oil to mimic the high PUFA energy contribution seen in many modern human diets.
Right, and that study provided some really clear, objective evidence of systemic metabolic destruction occurring relatively quickly. Outcome one was simply LA accumulation. The high PUFA diet successfully and significantly magnified the omega-6 content, specifically linoleic acid and its derivative, arachidonic acid, directly within the heart muscle tissue of the rats.
So it proved these fats get incorporated into working tissues, not just stored fat.
Precisely. It validated the premise that these dietary PUFAs are readily taken up and stored within the body's critical working tissues, impacting their function directly, not just being parked in adipose reserves.
And this accumulation then translates directly into actual cellular destruction.
That's what the study found next. Outcome two was cardiolipin destruction. This is where the technical detail is really essential but fascinating. Cardiolipin is a unique type of phospholipid found exclusively in the inner mitochondrial membrane, the powerhouse's inner lining. It acts as the structural foundation. You can think of it as the literal scaffolding that holds the entire electron transport chain complex, the ATP energy synthesis machinery, together in the correct configuration. Without intact cardiolipin, your cell's energy factory literally starts to fall apart.
Wow.
The study observed that the total amount of cardiolipin decreased almost sixfold in the hearts of the high PUFA diet group compared to controls. A massive drop. And this catastrophic structural loss directly correlated with a profound drop in the mitochondria's measured ability to actually synthesize ATP energy.
So the body's energy engine starts to literally crumble structurally. What did that mean for the heart's actual metabolic performance, its ability to burn fuel?
That led to outcome three, metabolic collapse. The researchers measured the ability of the heart tissue to actually burn glucose for fuel, what's called glucose oxidation. In the high PUFA diet group, glucose oxidation dropped almost to zero. Almost completely. The cells effectively lost their ability to properly process their primary fuel substrate, even when they were being forced to work harder. This demonstrated a fundamental systemic metabolic failure caused directly by the ongoing structural damage being delivered by that high dietary LA load.
And did the researchers observe actual physical structural damage under the microscope too, not just chemical changes?
They did. Outcome four was morphological damage. When they actually examined the heart cells using electron microscopy, the study found abnormal, misshapen structures described as condensed mitochondria only in the PUFA diet group.
Condensed mitochondria.
Yeah, to visualize this, it's not just subtle chemical damage, it's the physical crumpling and shrinking of the entire energy factory, indicating it's under severe stress and dysfunction. This visible structural alteration indicates severe functional damage that was entirely absent in the control groups eating lower PUFA diets.
So here's where the sources make the ultimate connection, linking this specific dietary component, excess omega-6, directly to the mechanisms underlying chronic illness.
Exactly. The sources synthesize this type of research by concluding that a diet consistently high in omega-6 fats leads directly to these specific, measurable, functional, and structural changes, the destruction of essential cardiolipin, the subsequent metabolic collapse, and the visible morphological damage within the mitochondria.
Okay.
This damage creates the precise metabolic state, particularly the inability to efficiently utilize glucose for fuel, mirroring the Warburg effect that is recognized scientifically as the precursor or perhaps the underlying metabolic cause of cancer and potentially other major chronic diseases like heart failure and neurodegeneration.
Therefore, the scientific imperative presented by these sources is clear. Rigorous avoidance and strict limitation of dietary omega-6 fats are not just some fringe dietary notion. They are presented as essential strategies for preventing mitochondrial destruction and potentially arresting the fundamental metabolic dysfunction that seems to drive so many of our most pervasive modern diseases. Okay, to synthesize everything we've really navigated today, the core revelation, the central message of the rock-solid diet framework as presented in these sources, seems to be that true, measurable health benefits stem from the deliberate, precise elimination of what they term the toxic dose of omega-6. It's about fundamentally moving past that old and likely impossible unscientific idea of just trying to balance out a massive 20-to-1 ratio with more omega-3.
Exactly. The path forward they propose is demanding, yes, but it's also very clear and crucially measurable.
Right.
You must target that 10-gram maximum daily limit for linoleic acid. And you achieve that by systematically avoiding seed oils, both in their pure forms and where they hide in processed foods, and by being highly selective about which animal fats you consume, specifically avoiding or strictly limiting those non-ruminant animal fats that have been metabolically compromised by modern feed practices.
It really forces a complete and probably necessary reevaluation of almost every component of the modern diet, doesn't it?
It really does. This level of specific, targeted elimination requires a level of critical thinking and consumer awareness that extends way beyond just looking at the front of the package or the basic nutrition facts panel.
Which leads us to a final, perhaps provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up.
Given that so many foods we once considered relatively benign or even actively healthy things like nuts and seeds, standard poultry like chicken, even common cooking oils promoted for decades are now shown by this research to be significant, potentially harmful LA contributors, primarily due to current agricultural and processing practices.
Yeah.
How might this singular quantified focus on omega-6 toxicity fundamentally change the way we, as consumers, need to evaluate and maybe even demand higher quality and accountability from all aspects of our modern food production systems? The source of the animal's feed, the processing of the oil, these details suddenly become arguably as important as the food itself.
That's a powerful question to reflect on. If you are ready to take this actionable knowledge, this framework, and apply it to your own health strategy, we definitely encourage you again to visit https://website.beacons.akak2020.
Yeah, that site has more resources, including those practical tools like the calculator, food list guides, and other educational material based specifically on this rock-solid approach.
And remember, as always, to check the episode description for additional resources, links, and information that can help you on this journey toward better metabolic health.
There's a lot more to explore there.
Thank you for listening to the Remedify Coaching Program podcast.